Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you see everything that just went down. The people who came after you, the ones who thought they had you mapped out, categorized, filed away in their predictable little boxes, they're in full panic mode right now. And I mean legitimate, genuine confusion, because you just did something that shattered every assumption they built their entire attack strategy around. They're not laughing anymore, they're documenting. You hear what I'm saying? There are literal meetings happening right now where your name comes up, where people are trying to dissect what you just pulled off like it's some kind of strategic masterpiece. Because the way you defended yourself, the way you moved, the way you operated, it wasn't anywhere in their playbook. They threw everything at you, expecting one set of outcomes, and you delivered something completely different. Something they're still trying to understand. You didn't break where they predicted you'd break. You didn't react how their psychological profiles said you would. You didn't crumble under pressure the way their experience told them was inevitable. Instead, you did something they've never seen before. And when someone operates outside the expected parameters, when someone rewrites the rules mid-game, it forces everyone else to go back to the drawing board. You're not just a story anymore. You're the lesson, the example, the case they reference when they're teaching others about what happens when you underestimate someone's capacity for adaptation. They thought you were vulnerable. They thought you were the target, the one who needed defending, the weak link. But what they failed to understand is that you weren't building defenses. You were constructing a fortress with no visible entrances, and they walked straight into its shadow, searching for doors that never existed. Here's what's really going down behind those closed doors. They're calling it your response protocol, like you engineered this whole thing, like you sat in some war room with advisors and contingency plans, mapping every possibility. But the reality is far more dangerous than that. You didn't design this, you evolved it. In real time, under fire. You took every hit, every cheap shot, every calculated betrayal, and you turned it into intelligence. You converted pain into data, and you used that data to become something they've never encountered before. Unpredictable through sheer adaptability. Let me break down what actually happened here, because this wasn't accident or instinct. This was intelligence, even if you didn't recognize it while it was happening. First move, you vanished, not just stepped back. I'm talking about complete withdrawal from their observation field, while they were watching for your reaction, waiting for the meltdown, waiting for the angry outburst. You gave them absolutely nothing. Total blackout, and that absence, that void where your response should have been, it drove them to the edge of sanity. Because people who feed on reactions need those reactions to survive. They need to witness the destruction they cause. But you deleted yourself from their feedback loop entirely. You stopped providing them with the metrics they needed to track you. Every provocation they launched, every trap they engineered, every manipulation they dangled in front of you, you simply refused to acknowledge. And that wasn't surrender. That was strategy. You starved them of the information they required to predict your trajectory. They were swinging at ghosts, trying to land blows on a target that had already relocated to coordinates they couldn't map. Second phase, you reconstructed yourself in complete darkness, away from their surveillance, away from their interference, away from their attempts to influence how you healed. They anticipated you'd need validation, that you'd reach out, that you'd justify yourself, that you'd fight for your narrative. But you did none of that. You went underground. You became inaccessible, unreachable, and in that isolation you metamorphosed. You weren't hiding in that darkness. You were being reforged. By the time you emerged, you were fundamentally different from the person they thought they knew. Third element, and this is where it gets truly fascinating. You started operating on an entirely separate timeline from everyone else. While they were still processing yesterday's conflict, you were already positioning yourself 5 moves ahead. While they were celebrating what they believed was your defeat, you were analyzing their behavior patterns, identifying their vulnerabilities, charting their blind spots. You stopped being reactive and became proactive, strategic, precise. You stopped defending against attacks and started positioning yourself where attacks couldn't reach you. Now here's where this becomes absolutely insane. They're literally creating documentation about what you did. Someone, somewhere, is drafting analysis reports using your situation as the primary case study. The title probably reads something like Neutralization through Strategic Non-Engagement, or The Weaponization of Silence in Modern Conflict. They're attempting to reverse engineer your methodology step by step because other people apparently need to learn this. You've become mandatory training material. Think about the implications. The same people who tried to dismantle you are now studying you, trying to decode how you survived their assault. The ones who set the traps are now analyzing how you bypassed every single one. The ones who launched everything they had at you are now asking themselves, how did they walk through that firestorm and emerge more powerful? You're not just a survivor at this point. You're an anomaly. You're the solution to a question they didn't know existed. The irony is devastating, because they approached you like you were the pupil, like they had teachings to deliver about suffering, about defeat, about harsh reality. But you inverted the entire power structure without uttering a single word. You became the instructor, and they became the bewildered students, frantically scribbling notes, trying to identify where their plan fell apart. Your defense mechanism, which they initially wrote off as passive or ineffective, proved to be the most sophisticated form of psychological combat they'd ever witnessed. They're labeling it now strategic withdrawal, emotional architecture, tactical non-response. They're assigning terminology, attempting to categorize it, trying to force it into conceptual frameworks they comprehend. But here's what they're failing to grasp. You didn't execute a strategy. You became one, your entire being. Your processing of trauma, your rebuilding methodology, your refusal to engage on their terms, all of it synthesized into something that can't be replicated through academic study alone. You can't train someone to become what you became, because what you became was forged in conditions they hope they never face. Let me get granular about the specific moves that have them completely stumped, because these are the elements appearing in their analysis documents. First, there's what they're documenting as the reflection principle. Instead of defending against their accusations, you simply mirrored their energy back at them without emotion, without fury, just pure reflection. They projected chaos. You returned stillness. They projected rage. You returned composure. They projected confusion. You returned clarity. And that equilibrium, that perfect symmetry, it neutralized everything they attempted. Then there's the energy conservation model, which is just a sophisticated way of saying you stopped burning your resources on people who hadn't earned them. You severed their supply line, their access to your emotional energy, your time, your focus, your reactions. They were accustomed to feeding off your responses, and when you terminated that fuel supply, they started cannibalizing themselves. You turned their own weapons against them by simply removing yourself as a viable target. Masterful. Absolutely masterful. Next up is what they're recording as anticipatory evasion, which sounds complex, but really just means you learned their rhythms so thoroughly that you could predict their strikes before they launched them. You knew when they were preparing to attack, so you weren't there when the hit arrived. You knew when they were constructing traps, so you navigated around them. You knew when they were attempting manipulation, so you became impervious to the manipulation. You developed an instinct for their tactics, and that made you impossible to corner. But here's the move that truly has them spiraling, the one they can't adequately explain in their frameworks. You weaponized your transformation. While they assumed you were shattered, while they believed you were trapped in victim consciousness, you were actually using that suffering as raw material for evolution. Every assault made you more precise. Every betrayal made you more intelligent. Every moment of isolation made you more formidable. You didn't just survive their warfare. You used it as conditioning and emerged as something they had zero defense against. The reason they can't release this, the reason they're still dissecting you months or even years afterward, is because you represent something terrifying to people who depend on dominance. You're proof that their methods don't work on everyone. You're evidence that some people can't be broken through standard protocols. You're a living refutation of every premise they built their confidence upon. And that uncertainty, that unpredictability, it haunts their every calculation. They need to comprehend you, because if they can't explain how you survived, then they have to confront the possibility that they're not as dominant as they believed. If one person can walk through their inferno and emerge unscathed, then maybe their inferno isn't as consuming as they thought. Maybe their weapons aren't as devastating. Maybe their strategies aren't as infallible. Maybe, just maybe, they're not the architects of destruction they imagined themselves to be. You demolished their illusion of omnipotence, so they study you. They analyze you. They attempt to decode you. Because understanding you means understanding where their plan failed. It means identifying the weakness in their approach. It means discovering a method to prevent someone else from replicating what you did. But here's what they're gradually realizing. There is no weakness in what you did. There's no flaw in your defense. You didn't win through some loophole or fortunate accident. You won because you fundamentally evolved beyond their operational range. And that's the reality that keeps them awake. That's the chapter in the manual they keep rewriting because they can't quite articulate it. You didn't defeat them through force. You didn't outwit them through some brilliant trick. You transcended the entire framework they were operating within. You opted out of their reality and constructed your own. And in that new reality, their rules, their tactics, their psychological warfare, none of it has jurisdiction. You became ungovernable. Now they're attempting to teach others how to replicate what you did. Which is almost amusing because what you did can't be transmitted through seminars or training courses. But let's examine what they're trying to replicate anyway, because it reveals just how thoroughly you've disrupted their understanding. First, they're teaching strategic silence, which basically means telling people to observe without responding. But what they don't grasp is that your silence wasn't a technique. It was a necessity born from exhaustion, from betrayal, from recognizing that communication was weaponized in their world. They're also attempting to teach emotional disengagement, which sounds straightforward, until you understand that your disengagement wasn't calculated strategy. It was self-preservation at the most fundamental level. You didn't choose to disengage because some manual instructed you to. You disengaged because remaining engaged was destroying you. That kind of disengagement can't be practiced. It can only be survived into. It's not a skill. It's a wound that calcified into protection. Then there's the concept of strategic positioning, which in their textbooks means placing yourself in advantageous situations before conflict emerges. But what you actually did was extract yourself from every situation where their power had traction. You didn't position yourself for victory. You positioned yourself for sovereignty. You chose environments where their judgments held no weight, where their presence couldn't penetrate, where their influence carried no authority. You built an entirely parallel ecosystem and flourished there. They're also documenting something they call narrative immunity, which is your ability to remain unshaken when people attempted to rewrite your history or characterize you as something you're not. But again, they're missing the core truth. Your immunity didn't stem from confidence or self-assurance. It came from knowing your truth so profoundly that external fabrications couldn't penetrate. You lived your experience. You know what transpired, and no amount of their revision could alter that internal knowledge. Here's where your approach gets truly fascinating to them. At some point, your defense stopped being defensive and became something else entirely. You weren't protecting yourself anymore. You were advancing. You weren't blocking strikes. You were making their strikes irrelevant. The transformation was subtle, but absolute. And they can identify the exact moment in their analysis when you stopped being prey and became something they couldn't classify. This is what they're struggling to capture in their studies. How does a defensive posture transform into offensive superiority without any aggressive action? You didn't strike back. You didn't retaliate. You didn't pursue revenge. But somehow everyone who engaged you ended up worse off than before they engaged. How did that occur? The answer is straightforward, but profound. You let them destroy themselves. You gave them enough rope, enough space, enough silence, and they destroyed themselves with their own contradictions. Your defense was so impenetrable, so absolute, that their attacks ricocheted back on them. Every lie they constructed about you eventually exposed their own dishonesty. Every trap they engineered ended up ensnaring them. Every manipulation they attempted revealed their own instability. You didn't have to fight because you built an approach where fighting was unnecessary. You created a system where their own momentum worked against them. That's expert-level psychological warfare, and they know it. And now they're trying to determine how you maintained your equilibrium through all of it. Because most people fracture under that kind of sustained pressure. Most people eventually explode, or collapse, or compromise their position. But you stayed consistent, stayed centered, stayed unreachable. That consistency is what transformed your defense into offense. Because it forced them to keep escalating, to keep attacking, to keep exposing themselves, while you remained calm in the eye of the storm they generated. But let's be honest for a moment, because these textbooks and analyses, they don't discuss what it actually cost you to construct this defense. They don't document the nights you couldn't sleep because your mind was processing betrayal on repeat. They don't include the section about the relationships you sacrificed because you had to eliminate everyone who might be a vulnerability. They don't mention the isolation, the solitude, the moments where you questioned whether this path was sustainable. Your defense mechanism wasn't some detached, calculated business strategy. It was survival mode, elevated to an art form. Every boundary you established came after someone violated one. Every barrier you constructed came after someone proved they couldn't be trusted. Every strategic silence came after words were weaponized against you. This wasn't a simulation to you. This was your life, your mental health, your future at stake. And you paid for this wisdom with fragments of yourself. They're studying your moves like they're strategic positions, but they're not accounting for the emotional cost of becoming this calculated. They're not measuring the burden of carrying this level of awareness every single moment, knowing that any instant of vulnerability could be exploited, knowing that trust is a luxury you can't afford, knowing that even your healing has to be conducted in secrecy, because people will weaponize your wounds if you expose too much. So yes, they're writing manuals about your defense mechanism. Yes, they're analyzing your every decision. Yes, they're trying to comprehend how you became untouchable, but they're missing the most crucial element. This wasn't a choice. This was transformation under extreme pressure. You didn't want to become this strategic. You had to. And that difference, that's everything. You're not a case study. You're a survivor who discovered how to stop surviving and start living on your own terms, regardless of who that threatens. And now here we are, with your name in footnotes, in discussions, in strategy sessions, in spaces you'll never see. People who have never encountered you are learning from your example, using your story as evidence that there are alternative ways to win. Ways that don't involve fighting back in predictable patterns. You've become a reference point, a benchmark, a measuring standard for what's possible when someone refuses to operate by the rules designed to keep them contained. Future people facing similar situations will read about what you did and think, maybe I don't have to fight. Maybe I can just extract myself. Maybe I can build something they can't reach. You've given permission through your actions for others to choose differently, to value their peace over proving themselves right, to walk away from battles that don't serve them. That's your legacy, whether you intended one or not, whether you ever receive acknowledgement for it or not. The textbooks will be incomplete because they can't capture everything. They can't measure spirit or will, or the quiet determination that keeps someone advancing when everything says retreat. They'll document the external actions but miss the internal revolution. They'll note the outcomes but not comprehend the process. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some things shouldn't be reduced to formulas and frameworks. Maybe your journey was uniquely yours and can't be replicated, only respected. But here's what you need to understand. Regardless of what they write, or study, or analyze, you accomplished something extraordinary. You survived focused assault from multiple vectors, survived betrayal, survived isolation, survived the attempts to break you. And you emerged not just intact, but transformed. You built a defense that protected not just your reputation or physical self, but your core being, your truth, your essence. And that's worth more than any textbook acknowledgement.